with that, I leave the floor open to Václav and Samuel to go ahead and start off their presentation. And we have 15 minutes allocated for each speaker, and then we'll leave the questions 20 minutes for each presentation, and then we'll leave the questions and discussions to the very end. So just to note, if anyone has any comments or questions, you can fire away in the chat, and we'll keep note of them. So yeah, without any further ado, I'll leave the floor open to Václav and Samuel. So go ahead, you can share your slides and whatnot, and that be all from me this stage.
Yeah, thank you, David, and good afternoon to everyone present here. My name is Václav Prusha. I am now a consultant, actually. I worked until recent in Nigeria, until October last year, as the seconded expert, as a seconded advisor to the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center as part of the German Development Cooperation support to Nigeria. I think Samuel will introduce himself when he comes in. Our presentation is actually not so much an academic one, it's more a practitioner one. I and Samuel and a lot of our colleagues back in Nigeria have been working on asset recovery as part of the Nigerian anti-corruption effort, and yeah, we've been present in recent years in almost all the Nigerian international asset repatriations, and also some of the policy discussions. I will just share, we have a short, small presentation here. I hope you can see it now. Are you seeing it?
Yep, yeah, it's there. We can see it all right. Thank you.
Perfect. So our topic is the rise of emerging destination countries, what it means for global asset recovery and advocacy. Perhaps from our experience from recent years in Nigeria and also in other countries in Africa, the asset recovery landscape, the illicit financial flows landscape is actually changing. In line with the global trends, we see that corruption proceeds actually and proceeds of other criminal activities are moving east. So it's not anymore the traditional financial hubs. It's not anymore exclusively New York, London, and others. It is more and more east. Of course, as all of you know, in terms of what we recover actually to the countries of origin, it is just a small fragment of what we actually lose. Again, if I can borrow the example of Nigeria, it is estimated that Nigeria loses around $18 billion a year to illicit financial outflows. That's just Nigeria. In Africa, we talk about 50 to 80 billion dollars, outweighing by far the overseas development assistance that actually Africa receives, combined with the foreign direct investment that Africa receives. So it is no surprise that what we actually recover, and I think the last OECD data talks just about 0.0 something of repatriated assets out of the assets that are actually frozen. So, you know, in terms of domestic resource mobilization for most of the African countries, including Nigeria, that is actually relatively successful in repatriating assets. It is a negligible number. And the trend, as all of you know, is that illicit financial outflows are actually increasing from the African continent and from most of the Asian countries as well. However, it's not all the gloom. When we talk about asset recovery, I think in recent years, the global south, and we can see it certainly in Africa, those of you who have been present or who have followed the last COSP in Egypt, have witnessed a number of side panels and quite robust initiative on presenting the African common position on asset recovery, where led by Nigeria, the African countries actually spell out the emphasis on the unconditional repatriation of stolen assets. Again, as clearly seen in Nigeria, but we see it also in, for example, in Kenya and Mozambique, in South Africa, the global north does provide extensive technical assistance as part of the overseas development assistance, but also as part of law enforcement cooperation and so on to the asset recovery effort, and increasingly so to civil society organizations. It's not just government to government, but also government to civil society and also to third parties. Of course, the new frameworks like the US Defense Act, the Magnitsky Act, and some of the other frameworks are slowly helping to ride on the momentum, so to say. So there is a bit of optimism, but the numbers are quite uncompromising. And as I said before, we are losing so much money in terms of illicit financial flows that the asset recovery is, in practical sense, not in the symbolic one, but in the practical sense, are quite negligible in terms of domestic resource mobilization for the countries of origin of the stolen assets. When my personal opinion is, and I talk as on behalf of the practitioners that have dealt with these issues at the policy level, at the national level, quite extensively, is that the understanding of the political economy of asset recovery is crucial from the perspective of destination countries, from the perspective of the countries of origin, from the perspective of countries where their neighbors are located. And we feel that in the asset recovery discussion, the political economy aspect is frequently missing. So, we spend discussing the technical problems, the legal problems, and so on, but somehow at the official level and also in the informal talks, we somehow oversee the political economy of things that we feel, for example, when you take the example of Nigeria, is extremely crucial. Again, from our groundwork in Nigeria, we felt that asset recovery from the governmental perspective is popular. It's popular with constituencies, it's popular with the population. Of course, I mean, who wouldn't want to have money back stolen by previous politicians? It just sounds good, it's sexy, it is a political easy sell, so to say. Importantly, and many of the academic papers produced have identified this, asset recovery is, from the political perspective, quite risk-free. We deal often with owners of stolen assets that are dead or disabled or out of power, that are political opponents. I overheard actually once a discussion about legal framework where a governmental official said, yeah, no, beneficial ownership is great, we will have it. Then we know where the assets of the opposition people are and we go after them. So, this anecdote somehow illustrates that from a political perspective, to know where illicit assets are and to go after them and to go for asset recovery is very popular. And we think that it is popular because it doesn't actually require significant domestic reforms. that are politically painful and quite difficult to implement. Sometimes we felt, observing especially the Nigerian cases, but some others as well, the success indicators, the success enablers are sometimes surprisingly banal, so to say, surprisingly simplistic. Law enforcement personnel loves it because it provides opportunities for lucrative training, for lavish travels, for skills that can be later transferred in private sector, and so on. And you might think that these are, reasons that can't be that important, but in our experience, sometimes they are actually. I mean, just to repatriate assets somehow harbored in US or UK is for many law enforcement officials surprisingly attractive, because it brings lucrative travels and lucrative per diems that are sometimes outweighing by far what these people receive on salaries. It is also quite easy to offset, from the perspective of the countries of origin, the failures to the others, to Western colonialism, corrupt previous leaders, to private sector enablers. Again, if most of you that followed the last course would see that there's been a lot of trading of blames to others, but not so much reflecting on, for example, the lack of management of recovered assets frameworks that are not present in most of the countries that excuse me, that require assets back. Again, I think when you work in Abuja on asset recovery, for example, or in Nairobi, there is a lot of talk about getting sorry, from London and so on, but not so much from Dubai, from the countries more east. And we feel that this discussion is really important to have, because when we look at recent years of the flows, the outflows of illicit funds, they actually more and more go to the new emerging financial hubs for obvious reasons. They provide sound financial infrastructure. They don't require extensive background checks. Civil society is not so much active in these hubs. For example, when it comes to Nigeria, just in Dubai, there are 800 properties linked to politically exposed persons in these countries, worth combined, I think, more than $400 million. To cooperate with Dubai, when you ask law enforcement officials almost everywhere in the world, they will tell you that it is extremely difficult in the practical sense. Not even simple requests for mutual assistance are responded. Communication is extremely difficult. This chart just explains, based on the Global Financial Centers Index, how the rise of the Asian and Pacific region has translated in the significance of these centers, and we could see it in our perspective also on the flow of proceeds of illicit flows into these hubs. For obvious reasons. So there is a real sense of fear that if proceeds are parked in the traditional financial hubs, the proceeds might be stolen. There is no so much fear of similar kind when it comes to the new emerging countries. And I think, again, we felt, especially on the civil society side, that the discussion about the role of emerging countries, emerging financial hubs, is missing, and this starts to be increasingly problematic as we see that the dynamic of the target of business flows is extremely going east. At this point, I hand over to someone who will take us further.
Thank you very much, Waslav. Good afternoon, everyone from Abuja, Nigeria. My name is Samuel Asimi. I work for the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, CISLAC. CISLAC is also Transparency International Nigeria. I'll just pick up from where Waslav has actually stopped, and here we'll continue with the effect of the rise in emerging destinations. So we're just looking at the effect. So generally, from my experience from the Nigerian perspective, and also dealing with issues around some of the effects we've seen so far, and these effects will definitely continue to rise as we have more destinations for lots of them. And I think one of them is we find the whole process of repatriating assets or recovery of assets quite expensive. We have lots of transaction costs, which in some cases up to 20%. We have a case in Nigeria where we had some recoveries and to pay the lawyers, try to get the legal books together and everything. The cost is actually even going up to 20%. We also have one with the Abacha loot, where it's actually been done, I think, with the World Bank. So you see lots of cost in terms of operating costs in trying to get these funds back. So you see it's very expensive. That's one. Two, we have processes that are very, very slow and lengthy, and sometimes the outcomes are actually unclear. You find the process of repatriation of assets going on for 2 years, for 2 decades rather. So 20 years, you still find different nations discussing on this. This has actually been an issue. I will definitely see more of this. Then when it comes to the recovery, we actually find some of this recovery, they actually staggered in the sense that they're actually coming in bits and pieces. We have that with the Abacha. In fact, in Nigeria, so you have we have Abacha 1, we have Abacha 2, Abacha 3. So you just have them being broken down, and sometimes from the same countries. So we understand that, yes, there are legal processes and legal works that should be done and carried out. But then again, the challenge of it being staggered is actually there. And there's an interesting point which we actually hear when discussing with representatives from the government. So they feel these funds don't actually have interest paid on them. So you have funds stolen from the country, say 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So when they are returned, in fact, they actually returned less than the amounts taken, because when you take out the legal costs and the rest, so these are issues that are there, and these are issues we will still face as we progress and have different emerging destinations for that havens for stolen assets. Then we find out that only a small number of countries constructively engage in this, looking at the expertise in terms of assets recovery. Not much countries have them. You need lawyers, you need people who would actually talk about this, who would investigate this. The expertise needed is actually not really there. Then generally, I think Vaslav touched on this earlier on. When you consider factors like the costs, the time spent in recovering the assets, when you look at it all through, sometimes it's actually insignificant in terms of the domestic resource mobilization of a country. A good example of this, I think we had this with the Abacha loot recovery, the one of $320 million in Nigeria. There was the challenge of how do we actually use this effectively? So you find this, it should be sent to the poorest of the poor. Of course, these are checks and balances set to ensure that these things don't get diluted. For that example, it was paid to the poorest of the poor as conditional cash transfer. But then you find different parts of the country and different individuals, like citizens actually don't really all fully agree with this. we have different diverging opinions on this.
Samuel, just to say, sorry, you've got about 1 minute left, but we can give additional 3 minutes for you to finish off, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine, though. Thank you very much. So next, we'll just be touching from the role of civil society organizations. We understand that we have lots of colleagues from the academia in the house who definitely do give us their own perspective. But so far, organization, we've seen that to some extent they've been increasingly well organized and competent. You find governments actually consulting with civil society organizations and having them being part of the agreements and negotiations. We also understand that there have been lots of focus on technical processes of asset recovery amongst CSOs. So there's a need to actually leave the technicalities and actually focus more on the main issues. And yeah, there is a need also to look at the political aspect of asset recovery. These are actually largely ignored by civil society organizations generally. And one thing which is actually very, very out there is the focus is actually out on international recoveries coming out, but there are also lots of potential of domestic recoveries. So you find houses, buildings within countries that are actually recovered by different government agencies. For example, in Nigeria, we have about 7 to 8 government agencies recovering assets. And what you have recovered internationally for the last decade would be something that's globally from different countries on an international scale, would be what one of the anti-graft agencies say the EFCC would actually recover in just about, say, 1 year. So I think there's an important for us to look inwards and look at the potentials of this. Then definitely the narrative of CSOs need to actually leave traditional destinations. They should also be focused on the other destinations we have. So new frontiers on this. I'll quickly run through this, which is my last slide on this. So in terms of the emerging, we have new financial hubs, illicit financial flows, money laundering, asset recovery. There's a need for us to engage and look at these areas. I think Václav mentioned in his slide where there's the dilemma between if tax evasion, tax avoidance, and the whole issues around it. So you find destination countries actually feeling as if they've actually not done something wrong because some of these things are actually, they might want to argue that tax avoidance, tax evasion, all those legalities, they might want to hold some of them and try to launder their images on these issues. It's also important for us to actually analyze the political context of these emerging destination countries. We should also look at it within the context of illicit financial flow. Civil society front should use lots of division of labor. And of course, we should actually also look around domestic asset recovery from different countries. So I think if we have all this covered and properly articulate the political sensitivities of some of these issues, we would actually work on asset recovery very well, and this will be very long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Václav and Samuel, for this insightful presentation. Oh, and there's the timer. We have 3 more presentations here. So just to clarify in the running order, if that's okay by everyone else, we have a team of 3 from Northumbria University, followed by Professor Christian Lasset, and then to finish off Tom Maine. So if Tony or is it Jackie, I'm sharing the presentation whilst I'll do the introductions here. If you want to start setting up the screen, sharing screen for your presentation. So we have, as I said, a team of 3 from Northumbria University, Dr. Jackie Harvey, Professor Tony Ward, and Dr. Sue Turner joining us from Northumbria University. And Dr. Jackie Harvey is Emeritus Professor of Financial Management at the university, and she was most recently the PI for the research project tracking beneficial ownership and the proceeds of corruption, evidence from Nigeria supported by the FCDO-funded Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. Professor Tony Ward is based at the School of Law in Northumbria, Newcastle upon Tyne, and he is a co-author with Professor Penny Green and of the renowned State Crime, Government's Violence and Corruption from 2004, and State Crime and Civil Activism, and he is Professor Penny Green's, together with Professor Penny Green, co-director of International State Crime Initiative based at Queen's Mary University in London. And apart from Professor Ward's interest and research in state crime, he also has keen interest in the law of evidence. And then the third member of the team, Dr. Sue Turner, is a senior lecturer in the university as well, and also a non-practicing solicitor with experience of banking and finance law. And her main research interest is financial crime, including anti-money laundering, with a focus on beneficial ownership transparency. And the presenters have come from Northumbria University to talk today to us about Nigerian-owned assets in the UK, which could be seen to raise red flags for potential links to corruption. So I leave the floor open to you. And because we have a team of 3 here, I'll allocate 20 minutes, but if you need additional 3, like the previous presenters, I will let you know at 19 minutes if you have a minute left, and then additional 3 just to wrap up. And then again, any comments or questions, if the spectators want to fire away in the chat, then we can keep a record of them for later on for the discussion at the end. So, yep, that's all from me, and go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. David, can I just check that everybody can actually see the presentation?
Yeah, I can see it, and
great.
I assume everyone can see it as well then.
Fantastic, thank you. We will do our best to keep to time. I've glanced to my side either way, once because I've got a watch and the others because I've just put a stopwatch on, just to try and make sure that we don't overrun. Today, actually, it's just myself and Tony who are going to be presenting this part of our project on behalf of the wider project team. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity. And the way that you've constructed the program is really nice. So our following on from the previous speakers is really very useful. So, you know, I think just having those couple of presentations together gives us plenty to be thinking about and talking about. So thank you very much. So what we're planning to talk about today, this is just a brief presentation overview. All of our project information, outputs from the work packages, the interim report and the final project report is just about coming on stream now, should all be available from that link. It's, if you Google Global Integrity Beneficial Ownership, you'll find our page, and there's a lot more information behind it. So the reasons that we are focusing on the dimensions of this broader project that we've selected for today are twofold. Principally, and first off, because the UK and Nigeria have very long and well-established links, both financially and commercially. So some of the work that we were looking at through the Bank for International Settlements, it was very clear that over half of bank investments, deposits and funds owned by legal entities in Nigeria actually find their home in the UK. So there's these very strong historic links and ties. The second reason is perhaps a bit more compelling from the rest of our project side, is the fact that through our analysis of how beneficial ownership was disguised through review and analysis of cases of grand corruption, there were three consistent features that we picked up. One was that frequently assets were moved from the initial perpetrator into the names of family members or close associates. Secondly was the creation of shell companies in Nigeria and in the overseas. And thirdly was investment in property. Again, that's something that was just being discussed in the last presentation, property in Nigeria as well as overseas. So it made sense to us to look at asset registries in the UK. And we were very grateful to both the Land Registry, who shared with us their registry of overseas companies ownership data, that being the one that was available, and to Companies House, who shared with us data of all companies where those of significant roles within those companies, such as directors or persons with significant control, had self-identified as being of Nigerian, as being Nigerian. So our analysis is going to look at some of the things that we looked at from those two databases, some of the work that we did in combining different data sets to see if they would help us. And then we'll move on to look at unexplained wealth orders. And we're mindful that there is also a presentation after us that's looking at these as well. So starting with company investment in property, this database that was shared was a very big one. There are some 97,000 properties registered over the period shown there. In the UK, they're actually owned by overseas companies. So we were quite excited when we started looking at this. And then we found there was actually only 152 that could be registered directly to Nigerian-based companies. Now, obviously, a big gap in the data is, and what we can't see is where a third country has been involved. So that may mean that a company could have been set up by somebody in Nigeria in, for example, the BVI, then that would show as a BVI investment, and we can't tie the two together. But nevertheless, our 152 properties gave us, our 152 properties registered to Nigerian-based companies gave us something that we could work with on a qualitative aspect. And you can see that the bulk of the registrations of those properties took place over a period roughly from between 2011 and 2016. We did hazard a guess that some of that may be due to the political cycle. There's nothing particularly staggering or outstanding about when we looked at what types of properties were being held. The average price paid was about £600,000. Obviously, the prices are as at the date of registration. The highest was 3.5 million. But one thing that we did notice that we thought was quite interesting was that a number of the companies had multiple property ownership. So you'll see there that the three companies that accounted for collectively 18 properties. So that sort of piqued our interest to understand why that might be the case. And having the names of those companies, we then were able to do a search of the Corporate Affairs Commission online registry for Nigerian companies, restricting ourselves to those that were only more than 2 properties in the UK. There were actually 31 that we identified. Unfortunately, 2 of those we couldn't find any information on. They may well have been dissolved. 29 were on the CAC register, only 1 of which was listed as active, and that one was established in 1930. All of the others, the remaining 28, are all listed as being dormant companies, which is interesting in and of itself. Nothing particularly outstanding about when those companies were created. There was 4 in 2007, 3 in 2008, 3 in 2014. One thing that we did notice was that where property price information was available, and it is a gap on the UK property registry database, where it was available, their total holdings were valued at 22.4 million. And of interest was that the companies, so 10 of the companies holding multiple properties, all had their property investments registered on a single date. So it's if they were going in and buying more than one property at once, and it all been registered on that date. I don't know if that's an administrative matter or it's some other reason. And one company registered their purchases in the UK 2 months after their company was registered in Nigeria. We then went and looked at the UK companies register, because that actually was much more interesting in terms of it had an awful lot more data in it. And again, they were very helpful to us and downloaded a set of data in which any director or any person affiliated with a company had identified themselves in the field officer nationality as being Nigerian. So that could be Nigerians domiciled in Nigeria or in the UK or indeed elsewhere. That gave us some 26,000 companies. Again, there's nothing unusual about that. There's no reason why that might appear strange. I've already said there's long-standing relationships between the two countries. We noted that over a quarter of the companies were business services, in IT consultancy and in management consultancy. What we did also wonder about, though, was frequency of affiliation. So was there any patterns that we could discern around ownership of multiple or involvement in multiple companies? And we took a cutoff of anyone holding a position in more than 10 different companies, or sorry, holding more than 10 different positions. So there's a lot of people who appear on the register who have a directorship in one company, but we were interested in the multiple ones. And you'll see there that there is one individual there holding 39 appointments. Those were with 21 different companies. And interestingly, that on the register, they provide their usual residence variously as the UK, as England, as South Africa, and as UAE. We're interested in these individuals who have multiple affiliations. And so we took that data and formatted it within the open source Graphs Common software. Now, we should remember here that we're only mapping single individuals with multiple directorships. So what we're not showing on this slide is all of the other individuals associated with each of these companies. So the pink dots in the middle, these ones in here, are the individuals, and the green dots are the associated companies with which they have affiliations. Because of our interest in real estate from the land registry, we thought it'd be quite interesting to then look at a subset of the larger data set, the 26,000 companies, that focused on those that declared as being in the broader SIC classification for real estate. And we took a download of those companies and took as a cutoff those with more than 5 individual directors. And that gave us 27 company names. We checked the company names against the those appearing against the list of individuals holding more than 10 appointments. So we're sort of cross-tabbing the two sets of data. And it was interesting that 2 companies appeared on both of these lists, and they're I do beg your pardon, they were coincidentally the ones that were showing those slightly more detailed relationships. So we had company names that we thought were worth looking at. Again, there's nothing to say that any of these companies, the individuals, the investments, that there's anything untoward about any of them, but they may warrant further investigation. So in this instance, we started from this company here, FGIMV Limited, and looked at all of the directors of that company, and then went to look at those next individuals, the individuals that we identified as being, which are the blue dots, to then look at what else they were invested in, what else they were affiliated with. And that enabled us to draw this type of diagram. So what was particularly, sorry, I do beg your pardon. Let me just go back. This is what happens when, there we go. Right. So what was also of they actually are the same person, or we believe them to be the same person because of common data that's not shown here. But it was interesting that for one group of company, they used one designation, and for another group of companies, they use a different one. All of these individuals are joined by a common surname or family name, except for this one. And so we believe them to be part of the same either immediate or extended family. The other company that we had identified was MGPS Limited, slightly different structure against this one, where starting from the company, there were 3 directors who didn't have any further involvement with any other companies. But 2 of the directors, both of whom shared the same surname, then had also multiple other companies. So what we were wondering about was the extent to which something like this may identify for us some potential red flags. And it's not to mean, as I keep saying this, that any of the individuals or the companies or the transactions in which they're involved have been illegal, but that they may warrant further investigation. So we were wondering about companies that may be created and then lapse into dormancy. Again, there's nothing necessarily illegal about that, but it does look strange that if a company, basically if it's dormant, it's no longer doing any trading, so it's not posting any accounting data. It just seems strange that their purpose seems then to be the holding of property in another country. We wondered about company officials using different names for different companies, or about providing multiple places of residence. This may be an issue with the way data is recorded or requested in the UK registries, but it may also be something that should be a potential flag. And finally, coming from our wider work on beneficial ownership, failure or delay in providing updated information to registries. So again, so what we're suggesting is these flags may trigger or may provide a trigger for a need for further investigation, as they could point to unexplained wealth. And it's to unexplained wealth now that I hand over to Tony. So I'll try very hard, Tony, not to touch anything until you give me the nod. So there you are.
Yes. Well, I think I can be very brief about this because I'm conscious we only have 2 or 3 minutes left.
Sorry, Tony. Yeah, just to say, I've 3 minutes 30 seconds. But if you need additional couple of minutes,
right. Well, probably the 30 seconds has gone by now, and I'll try and finish without being time. Because we know there's another paper about unexplained wealth orders. But basically, we just want to say, well, this is seen as an investigative tool for investigating individuals or companies and their property about whom information is available. So we thought, could they be suitable for here? Following the really labyrinthine statutory provisions, if a company is associated with a politically exposed person, a PEP, within the meaning of, I think it's the Corporate Taxes Act 2010, then the company can itself be regarded as a PEP, as I understand it, and you can potentially make an unexplained wealth order against it. I think both the possibilities of this and the dangers are shown in the case, which I'm sure many people who will be familiar with the National Crime Agency in Baker. And I think what the Baker case shows is that it is very important to identify the right PEP that your company is associated with. Otherwise, the National Crime Agency just winds up with egg on its face and a lot of legal fees. So UWOs aren't really going to work where the beneficial owner is hidden behind a very intricate corporate structure. But the thing is, these companies that we're looking at, actually, the structures aren't that intricate, and where you have these companies that all seem to be controlled by the same family, we suspect it may not be rocket science to identify who the right PEP is. And this leads us to think that maybe UWOs, which, as I'm sure most people know here, have been very little used so far, may have possibilities for investigating these sorts of companies. And I think that's really all I need to say at this stage.
Well, that's us. I think nicely concluded. Thank you. Anything else, Tony, that you wanted to add?
No, that's me done.
Brilliant. Okay. So, well, thank you very much, David. I'll stop sharing and hand back over to you.
No worries. Thank you for this excellent presentation and very well coordinated. And thanks for wrapping up quickly, Tony. And our next speaker is Professor Christian Lasted. So whilst I do the introductions, Chris, if you'd like to set up your PowerPoint slides, that would be awesome.
No PowerPoints for me. You just get my face, I'm afraid.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll just get to listen to your captivating voices. So Professor Christian Lasted University, where he is based at the criminology and criminal justice. There's Tony's and Jackie's timer, criminology and criminal justice program, and his research focuses on issues of kleptocracy, transnational corruption networks, and anti-money laundering regimes, with regional expertise in Central Asia and South Pacific. And his most recent book that was published is entitled Uncovering the Crimes of Urbanization, Researching Corruption, Violence, and Urban Conflict. And Professor Christian Lasted is today talking to us about the snowballs in hell, the challenge of identifying, seizing, and returning a kleptocrat's loot. And Christer is drawing on 6 years of investigative research into transnational networks operating corrupt schemes in Central Asia. And in this paper, he is exploring the impunity they enjoy when it comes to money laundering, and face minimal risk of detection, much less investigation and prosecution. And in the small sample of cases that are the subject of prosecution and are and asset recovery, he is arguing that there are significant barriers preventing meaningful return of assets for benefit of those who are victimized and harmed by kleptocrats in Central Asia. So, Chris, I leave the floor open to you, and turning the timer on, so 20 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. And I really love to respond to some of the very interesting papers before, but I'm conscious I don't want to, there'll probably be time for that later, because there's some really interesting connections. I think the paper today for me is premised on the idea that, firstly, you know, grand corruption is usually transnationally organized, so it's a transnational crime, and therefore, if we're talking about successfully seizing assets, particularly assets that have been looted and stored abroad, we also need to have effective anti-money laundering systems that are able to detect the illicit flows of value on a rigorous and systematic basis, so that once they're detected, they can be frozen and then the subject of return procedures. If you don't have an operating AML system in place, it's not effective. It's very unlikely you're going to detect any illicit flows of value coming onto your shores. And I'd like to explore the reality of this relationship, because I like to work in the world of reality and practice, and not in the world of theory and the kind of common sense. And doing that through a case I've been following very closely for 6 or so years, the centers on Uzbekistan, where I do a lot of my work, centering on the case of Gulnara Karimova. And it's quite a famous case, and I'm going to use that as a real pivot. Because I think if we deep dive into the Gulnara Karimova case, it kind of offers a number of interesting lessons, I think, about AML, and also about AML and the limits of asset recovery. So I will jump into that. You know, you would think the Gulnara Karimova case that it's actually a case that maybe suggests the system in fact works, because Gulnara Karimova right now is in prison in Tashkent, and her assets in Switzerland and various other European theatres are either in the process of being seized or have been seized and will be returned shortly. But I would argue that in fact once you look at the detail, a more complex picture emerges. And so I'm going to jump in there and explore that. And just to give people a bit of a backdrop, in case you're not following closely the day-to-day events in Uzbekistan, Gulnara Karimova is the eldest daughter of Uzbekistan's first post-Soviet president, Islam Karimov, who passed away as president in 2016. And obviously during Islam Karimov's reign, it was associated with obviously an extreme form of authoritarianism. And I think it's fair to say that it's hard to overestimate the amount of power that pooled in the president's office during his tenure. And I think it's also fair to say that Gulnara Karimova, his eldest daughter, leveraged her father's power in order to set up her own business empire, and as we've found from prosecutions, deferred prosecution agreements, and other investigations, that that empire was built in significant part on illicit activities. That business empire was built on illicit activities. And that illicit income came in large part, or a significant part, from the fact that Gulnara acted as a gatekeeper for a number of very lucrative sectors in Uzbekistan, and one of the most lucrative being the burgeoning telecommunications sector, which was just beginning to take off in the early 2000s. And in order for telecommunication companies to get access to that market, they had to pay significant bribes to Gulnara Karimova's group, and then they would be able to enter the market. And a number of companies have admitted to paying substantial bribes, and those companies include the Russian mobile telecommunication system, MTS, mobile telesystems, Vimpelcom, which I think now is known as Vion, and the Swedish company TeliaSonera. They're all mega corporations, big multinationals, some of the biggest in the world in the telecommunications sector. And over $800 million in bribes were solicited, and they were solicited in large part through an offshore vehicle that was set up by Gulnara Karimova's group in Gibraltar. a UK offshore territory. And that company was called Tackleant Limited. And that was incorporated in 2004. And on paper, its shareholder was a young Armenian lady, resident in Tashkent by the name of Gayana Avakian, who at the time these schemes were set up was the ripe age of 21, conducting her undergraduate studies at university, I believe in finance. And through Avakian's company, a series of sham commercial agreements were set up to launder the bribes to the Karamova group. And so what we saw with the different telecommunication companies, they had things like they would be buying licenses, telecommunication licenses and frequencies from Tackleant Limited, when in fact that normally is a sovereign asset, which is sold by governments to make significant revenues to be used for public services. They weren't, they were obviously privatized through this scheme. Also, we found, or what was found through the investigations was they were also Tackleant and one other or two other companies were also selling things like consultancy services as well as another mechanism. And there were also some share buyback agreements that were also used, again, all sham commercial agreements to launder bribes. So what we had in the Karamova case was we had sham commercial agreements using offshore companies which had offshore bank accounts. And those bank accounts were held primarily with Standard Chartered Bank in the UK and also Lombard Odier in Switzerland, with a bit of the use of the old Parex Bank in Latvia. So we're in a classic AML situation here, where these schemes, complex schemes, were set up, and they were set up by these telecommunications companies with the assistance of external law firms. I won't name them because I don't want to get sued, but some of the biggest law firms in the world from Europe and North America helped set up these schemes, and we're party to administering them, which is not to suggest that they're all guilty of various crimes. That would have to take place through due process. They were also, these schemes also involved other parties. Obviously, they involved the corporate service providers who set up the offshore companies. You had the banks who are providing the financial services, and also you had other people involved. For example, a large Russian investment bank helped do the valuations that helped create a bit of the veneer for these sham commercial agreements. Now, when these schemes were set up, all these external, I've had I've looked through hundreds of emails that were from TeliaSonera, internal TeliaSonera emails, and that provided quite a powerful window into what these different external actors, legal counsels, law firms, etc., what facts they were privy to, and they were all aware that a company called Tackleant Limited was essentially providing a number of services. It was helping set up providing licenses and frequencies. It was also providing political protection. That was made clear in the internal emails that through Tackleant support, they would be afforded political protection in a very ruthless and unpredictable environment, and also that they would be getting certain privileges. At the time, currency conversion was heavily restricted and only VIPs had access to it. And it was made clear that Tackleant Limited could get access to currency conversions. But what was rather interesting from an AML perspective was that the executives at TeliaSonera and the other multinationals they were all aware of who really was behind Tackleant Limited. They knew it was Gulnara Karamova, but in their communications with their external advisors, their external partners, they didn't disclose that fact. They didn't say to, for example, their law firms they were working with, Gulnara is really behind this company. And they also didn't solicit that fact to their boards of directors when they were providing memorandums. Instead, what they said was that the person who was actually behind Tackleant Limited was the Guyana Avakian. So we had a situation where all these different parties, European law firms, European banks, all with quite strict AML duties to carefully scrutinize the major transactions that they're dealing with, were told that Tackleout Limited was providing all these amazing services, and it was owned and operated by a youthful Armenian based in Tashkent, who was able to get all these privileged services in a rather ruthless and corrupt context, and no one seemed to batten an eyelid. And we don't know in particular always what the story was when people did choose to ask questions, but we do know in one instance when the Swiss authorities in 2012 did begin to ask some rather standard due diligence questions about this arrangement. And in response, Guyana informed the Swiss authorities that the reason that she had been able was the Uzbek telecommunications market and earn hundreds of millions of dollars in her early 20s was because she had an uncle who was an experienced businessman who mentored her. And that was the sum total of the explanation that was given for this rather unlikely situation. We also know we also have access to other leaked documents that give an insight into AML processes. One of these other leaked documents, or should I say series of leaked documents, involved Gulnara Karamova's efforts to purchase a private jet. And in order to do that, she enlisted the assistance of a large London-based accountancy firm who, in order to buy the jet, was going to set up an Isle of Man holding company that would hold the jet. And this Isle of Man, this London accountancy firm that was conducting this transaction was asked by the Isle of Man corporate service provider as to the source of wealth that was going to buy this jet. And the story that was given was that this source of wealth was from a Hong Kong company called Expeline Limited, and that was owned by an individual called Rustam Madumarov, who was Gulnara Karamova's boyfriend. But obviously they didn't disclose this in their due diligence information that they gave to this Isle of Man corporate service provider. Instead, what they provided was a letter from an Uzbek banker, Sharuk Sabarov, who claimed that he could vouch for the sources of wealth. It turned out later that Mr. Sabarov was in fact part of Ms. Karamova's group and was subsequently arrested in Switzerland. But at the time, Mr. Sabarov in 2010, before his arrest, informed the Isle of Man corporate service provider that Mr. Madumarov had been given $100,000 by his brother back in, I think, in the early 2000s. And through that, he set up a media company called the Terror Group. And that Terror Group had then successfully set up a major media empire. Now, I warn everyone on this call, I have now got a 4-year-old who has just entered my office. So, and I have been, I have planned ahead, and I've got a chocolate frog to give her so that you take that and go downstairs. So there you go. I learned from the BBC moment, always keep chocolate and standby. So we were told that Madumarov was in fact made this money through the Terror Group. Again, all regulated firms. Now, if anyone had Googled Terror Group in 2010, they would have seen that it was widely reported to be owned by Gulnara Karamova, who was also reported to be Madumarov's boyfriend. And so despite all these red flags that really should have had hair raised and eyebrows raised, it was never these red flags that led to the Karamova group unraveling. It was in fact because one of her key managers, Bektor Akhmedov, they had a significant falling out. And because of that falling out, that triggered a sequence of events that led to a Swedish media expose and led to Swiss anti-money laundering investigations. And so I think once we look at the detail there, it actually provides a very poor portrait of the AML frameworks that are operating in regions such as the UK and in Switzerland. And then you know, I won't go into other cases, but I've been tracking other cases in Uzbekistan, ones involving large Uzbek conglomerates that are ultimately owned by senior state officials. And they, again, are being set up and operating through offshore companies and based in the UK and Switzerland. And I think it is interesting to say there is a movement east as well. We're definitely seeing more greater use of the UAE. And interestingly, in Uzbekistan, we're seeing a lot of use of Turkey as well as a place to set up offshore holding companies because of the opaqueness there. And also Singapore as well. And we're also, and these, again, these offshore operations are seemingly able to take place fairly effortlessly and without any disruption. We're also seeing examples today of individuals who have pretty explicit connections to organized crime, both in Uzbekistan and in Russia. And they also seem to have no problems buying property in swanky parts of London, setting up their holding companies in places like London and Switzerland. So a lot of the problems that we saw in the Karamova case seem to be reoccurring. So I would suggest right now, if we're going to speculate, there's probably 10 other Karamova-like groups operating out of Uzbekistan who are circulating illicit assets through different theatres like Switzerland, like the UK, and almost certainly some of those new eastern corridors referred to in the really interesting first paper today. And so just to conclude, I'd like to then jump back to the Karamova case and say, okay, in that case, not because of effective AML, but because of an eruption within the group itself, the money was seized. But that is not where obviously the challenges end. The Karamova assets were seized in 2012. And that is a decade ago right now, and they still haven't been returned yet. And some people might smile on this call and say, well, that's actually a pretty youthful case, because some of them go 10 years. And in this case, the reason it's taking so long is because obviously the people concerned can retain counsel. And if you go and look at the Swiss legal archives, you will see appeal after appeal after appeal lodged by Karamova's counsel and also one of her former managers, and it's very difficult. They obviously are given, the Swiss authorities give Karamova's counsel all the information on what they're doing, but obviously the public have very little information, because in the case of Switzerland, even the legal cases are anonymized. So it's very hard to track what's actually going on in Switzerland, because when you open up a court decision, all you see is the names removed and they're replaced with A, B, C, D, E, F. And it's only if you know all the dates and times you can actually decipher who's who and what's what. On top of that challenge, in the case of the Karamova case, you have...
1 minute left, Chris.
No worries. You have a problem that the Swiss courts will not recognise the decisions in Uzbekistan because they don't believe that they've been made in a fair manner. And that is a fair enough point by the Swiss courts, because Uzbekistan's criminal justice system is not known for its due process and fairness. But what that means is that the only decisions on which can be relied to seize the assets are the ones that are being pursued by Swiss authorities against various members of Ms. Karamova's entourage. And obviously she can't be indicted because she's in prison. So what's that meant is that, yes, a large amount has been seized, and over 400 million has been seized, but in December, $70 million was ordered to be returned to Tacklant Limited. That's a huge whack of money by any stretch, and that's simply because it's the lack of a predicate crime due to those challenges that I just mentioned. And in order to return that money, we've seen an MOU signed between the government of Switzerland and the government of Uzbekistan. And in that MOU, they promised to uphold standard transparency, accountability, inclusiveness with civil society, and that they would concrete those promises in 2 subsequent agreements, a sharing agreement and a restitution agreement. Don't worry, David, I'll be done in 30 seconds. And currently, the sharing agreement has been signed, and the government of Switzerland is refusing to make it public, and a civil society coalition is having to pursue litigation in order to make the sharing agreement public. So one would argue that they're falling down fairly early on in the transparency, and the restitution agreement is likely to be signed later this year. But I think civil society are probably not holding out great hopes that it will have significant elements of civil society participation or rigorous oversight. And we know that the risks that are posed in Central Asia by the Kazakhstan 2 return case. So I guess the sort of moral of the story for this, what I think the Karamova case reveals to us, is that there is a lot of significant shortcomings in the AML system. And as a result, we're very likely to see illicit assets identified or seized in regions such as the UK and Switzerland. And when I was trying to think of a theme, you know, I was thinking, when it comes to AML at the moment, the first word that comes to my mind is the name of that recent Netflix sensation, Don't Look Up. And so I think when it comes to AML in certainly places like Europe, the watchword is Don't Look Up, because it's a rather messy picture.
Well, thank you, Chris, for this very insightful and detailed synopsis of the of kleptocracy, corruption, and money laundering, and Uzbekistan. And now we shall move to our last speaker of this session of the day, Thomas Maine, who's coming to us from Exeter University. And Thomas is an expert in corruption studies and Central Asian politics for the past 12 years. Tom has been working as a senior campaigner for all well-to-known Global Witness, which is an anti-corruption NGO focusing in particular on exploitation of natural resources. And he was involved and responsible for Eurasian investigations, covering such case studies and topics as the Russian-Ukraine gas crisis, the listing of Kazakh companies on the LSE, money laundering in Kyrgyzstan, and the opaque practices of Azerbaijanese state oil company. And today, Tom will be talking to us about criminality, notwithstanding the use of unexplained wealth orders in anti-corruption cases, and how since their coming into force in 2018, there have only been 4 known UWO cases, one of which, the NCA versus Baker, a case study included in this presentation, ended in dismissal of the orders. And we are keen to learn more about these unexplained wealth orders and how they have produced a rather dismal impact on corruption and grant corruption. So I leave the floor open to you, Tom. 20 minutes on the button, and I'll let you know 19 minutes if you have 1 minute left. But yeah, so there you go.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. 20 minutes is a bit of a luxury. Usually you only get 7 or max 10. So I'm glad for the extra time. So next month, Professor John Heathershaw and I will release a 23,000 word report on unexplained wealth orders. And today I'm going to take you through some of the findings. Now, what's the aim of unexplained wealth orders, or indeed any anti-corruption legislation, the idea, of course, is to stop the families of dictators and autocrats from enjoying the spoils of corruption that they have parked in the UK. Now, with that in mind, first, before we get into the weeds of unexplained wealth orders, is to present two case studies to you and ask you, which do you think is the more suspicious? If you were an anti-corruption investigator, which one would you think is a better case? So the first one features a house in London, lived in by a couple from Azerbaijan. The husband in the couple, Jahangir Hajiev, was jailed for financial crime in Azerbaijan. You could say that's good evidence of perhaps this money reaching the UK, but on the other hand, he claims it was politically motivated, and in such autocracies as Azerbaijan, people who fall out of favor will be put in prison. Hajiev's salary was not high enough to afford this property, but then again, he may have had other business assets which might explain this property. Of course, there were a lot of questions about Hajiev's wealth. This particular gem of a document shows that in 1991, when Hajiev was supposedly studying for his PhD in Texas, he made $20 million on the back of a $1,000 investment from some company he'd founded in Azerbaijan. But we don't know that this money reached the house, because he was in jail at the time, and his wife said, legitimately or otherwise, I don't know about the purchase of this house, and he's in jail, so I can't ask him about what he used. So, interesting case. Let's compare this now to another property, $40 million, lived in by Nurali Aliyev, a Kazakh businessman, and also the grandson of the first president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev. He got a $65 million loan to purchase this house. Now, we all need mortgages, don't we, when we buy property in London? But this wasn't an average kind of mortgage. He received this $65 million loan from a bank that he himself was the chairman of, and his mother, Dariga Nazarbayeva, who's the daughter of the then president of Kazakhstan, was the main shareholder of. And we haven't seen any loan agreement. We've not seen this loan being mentioned in any of the bank's financial reporting, and there's no evidence to suggest that he paid this money back. And he used this money directly for this house purchase. And he did it in a very obscure way. Now, I don't know about your mortgage, but mine certainly isn't structured like this. It was routed through various shell companies, all of which he owned. If you see the flow there going through Terra Holdings, it was then loaned to Jupiter Intertrade, loaned again to Triumph Alliance, and then finally to a client account, and the house purchase was effected. But he owned all of these companies. So it didn't make any sense from a commercial point of view. And that, of course, is a red flag for money laundering as defined by our money laundering regulations. So it seemed like he was trying to obscure the fact that he'd got this loan from his own bank and put it into a house. And yet, when both of these properties were issued with unexplained wealth orders, it was the first property the unexplained wealth order was upheld, the Hajiev property, and this property where the unexplained wealth order was dismissed. And I'm going to go on to reasons why in the rest of my time. But when we look at these two cases, I think you'll agree that they are perhaps as suspicious as each other, or perhaps because we have more information, that the second example is perhaps even more suspicious than the first example. So what's the difference? And if we compare the two men, the cases seem very similar, but key to my mind is that bottom bullet point, that at the time of the unexplained wealth order, Nurali Aliyev was in favor in his home country. May well have changed in the last couple of weeks, but at the time of the unexplained wealth order, his family was still very much part of the power structure in Kazakhstan, whereas Hajiev was persona non grata. He was in jail in Azerbaijan, and this has a definite effect of the information we get related to unexplained wealth orders and how they are how they work in practice. So that's not quite accurate. Unexplained wealth orders are simply an investigative tool, a disclosure tool. The process of civil recovery is still the same as it ever was. Now, where unexplained wealth orders have an advantage for law enforcement is that before unexplained wealth orders, whenever we tried to find any information about a property from a kleptocracy, obviously the kleptocracy was not going to help us in that investigation. We had no information. So when it came to trying to prove a case to the civil level of proof, which is on the balance of probabilities that this money is obtained from criminal capital, if there's no evidence, then there's no weighing of probabilities, and so that case would necessarily fail. Wealth order, and you do not answer that order, we then create a presumption that the criminal capital was used to buy that property, and then when we go to civil recovery, we can use that. We don't need to get into the balance of probabilities. We have a presumption that criminal capital was used, so we have a possibility of then recovering a property if an unexplained wealth order has not been answered. So that's kind of a revolutionary idea. It's the reversal of the burden of proof. So could be, in theory, useful. And indeed, when unexplained wealth orders were brought in, we heard a lot from our government about how these were going to target kleptocracy, grand corruption, not just organized crime, but those politicians who have big houses, small salaries. We're going to go after you because we have this new unexplained wealth order legislation. And it was forecasted that 20 unexplained wealth orders investigations would happen every year. But as Jackie alluded to in her presentation, that has not transpired. And indeed, there have only been 4 known unexplained wealth order investigations to date. 2 of them I've mentioned already. The National Crime Agency versus Hajiva, that was successful in the fact that the unexplained wealth order was upheld, but the civil recovery procedure is still ongoing and may fail. So we can't quite say that is a success yet. It's ongoing. The Kazakh case I alluded to is referred to as NCA versus Baker. We'll get on to problems that caused, that Tony alluded to a little bit later on. That one was a dismal failure, and that was dismissed. There have been 2 other UWOs not featuring politically exposed people. One, a man from the north of England, Hussein, had suspicions, allegations that he was linked to serious organized crime. There was no civil recovery procedure. It led to a settlement, and Hussein handed over 45 properties. So that one was successful. And the 4th one related to a Northern Irish woman with suspected links to paramilitary groups. We don't know what happened. So really, we only at the moment can point to one successful unexplained wealth order investigation that has led to some kind of money being recovered. And very importantly, no unexplained wealth order has been issued since 2019. What do you need to issue an unexplained wealth order? You need to satisfy 4 different conditions. One, that the respondent holds the property and it's worth something. It's pretty obvious. Number 3, that the known income is insufficient to obtain the property. That is interesting. We'll get onto that in a sec. And the 4th, that the respondent is either a politically exposed person or there are suspicions of links to serious crime. And it's this element of politically exposed persons in the unexplained wealth order, which is again revolutionary in terms of legislation. Both Australia and Ireland have unexplained wealth orders, but they are not related to politically exposed people. They can only be issued where there is allegations or evidence of serious crime. So this is what you need to fulfill an unexplained wealth order. But the way the legislation is worded causes problems, especially in relation to politically exposed people who are still in power. So, for example, income is lawfully obtained if it is obtained lawfully under the laws of the country from where the income arises. So, why is this important? Well, it's important because when you have kleptocracies, they obviously control everything. They control the law courts, they control the prosecutor's office, and they can just appeal to those authorities in order to give them a clean bill of health. So that loan I mentioned, which looked very suspicious at the beginning of this talk, the bank in question, Norbank, which is no longer owned by Darigha Nazarbayeva, but by, I would say, one of her associates, they said that that loan was legitimate. Okay, so fine then, nothing to see here. Any of the assets that were sold by Darigha Nazarbayeva and Nurali Aliyev, the Kazakh Prosecutor General's Department said that all of them were fine. There was no illegal activity. So we're trying to set up something to try and counteract the fact that we can't get evidence from kleptocracies. And in one of the very first cases, this is the judgment, by the way, we're relying on that evidence to say that these assets are okay. Second problem with unexplained wealth orders, that known sources are sources of income that are reasonably ascertainable from available information made at the time of the application of the order. This statement here is again from the judge who ruled on the case, saying that Darigha Nazarbayeva is a successful businesswoman who is listed in Forbes' 50 richest people in Kazakhstan. Now, that may very well be that Darigha Nazarbayeva is one of the richest people in Kazakhstan, but it says nothing about the legitimacy or otherwise of her assets. It seems just having that very report on the internet from Forbes would be enough to, in quotes, explain the wealth that has been put into these properties. So again, bizarre for legislation which is supposed to look at legitimacy of wealth. Well, supposedly, I guess you could say it's really about the lack of explanations of wealth, but we're not questioning when these kleptocracies give information such as this of the sources of wealth. A third problem, purported compliance. Now, this is an interesting one, in that if we rewind a few slides, I was talking about how unexplained wealth orders can help in civil recovery cases. That is only when the person fails to respond to an unexplained wealth order. If they do respond to an unexplained wealth order, and not only that, so if they comply, but if they even purport to comply with the order, that presumption that criminal capital has been used to acquire the property no longer applies, and you're back at the having to show that on the balance of probabilities in a civil recovery procedure that the funds used were criminally obtained. So you're back to square one. So basically that means that if you just produce some kind of information about your sources of wealth, you are going to either comply or purport to comply with the order, and that key element, the presumption of criminal capital being used, is going to fall away. And indeed, in NCA versus Baker, Darigha Nazarbayeva and Nurali Aliyev produced 268 pages of documents, in quotes, explaining their wealth, including, by the way, all that information I just gave you about the loan. That was voluntarily given up by their lawyers about how they purchased these properties. So there's not some kind of, big investigation that I've done. This is from the horse's mouth that Nurali Aliyev got a $65 million loan to buy that house on Bishop's Avenue. So there's a problem there. Fourth, and this is what Tony was touching on earlier, problem with trustees and who actually controls properties. I think it was useful that there was a provision in the unexplained order legislation that you can issue an unexplained wealth order against a trustee or a lawyer or a nominee holder. I think that is good because sometimes you won't get to know the beneficial owner. However, if you remember those four conditions, the respondent, the person you're you're giving the order to must be a politically exposed person. In the case of NCA versus Baker, Andrew Baker, was a British solicitor based in Liechtenstein. Now, he's not a politically exposed person, and he's not really involved with serious or organized crime. Part of the reason why the case failed was because the National Crime Agency tried to argue, I'm going to say a little bit more about this character in a while, they tried to argue that the properties were bought from the proceeds of crime obtained by Rahat Aliyev, the former husband of Dadiga Nazarbayeva. But Rahat Aliyev, at the time of the unexplained wealth orders, was dead. He'd committed suicide, apparently, in a jail in Austria. And this guy, Andrew Baker, had never met him, and in fact had only been brought in to the property structure. He was the president of these Panamanian foundations that owned the properties. He was only brought in after Aliyev had died. So there was no link between him and Aliyev. So the case pretty much collapsed on that. They should have, I think, in my estimation, vacated those UWOs against Baker and reissued them against Dadiga Nazarbayeva because she voluntarily revealed that she was the beneficial owners of the properties. And finally, the fifth problem is that for some reason, an amendment that would have meant that any costs related to losing investigations would not be awarded, this was rejected. So it meant that when the National Crime Agency lost the case against Baker and Dadiga Nazarbayeva, Norali Aliyev, they were landed with a £1.5 million bill for their costs. The 2007 Home Office impact assessment suggested that each investigation would cost at a max £10,000. So in one fell swoop, it seemed that the NCA had wiped out not only its UWO budget, but seemingly its entire budget when it had to pay 1.5 million in costs to Dadiga Nazarbayeva and Norali Aliyev. And I think I'll just before I show that slide, I think the case failed for three reasons. It failed because the National Crime Agency didn't do a very good job about rebutting the information provided by Mishcon Dorea, which is the lawyers representing the respondents. It failed because of these flaws I've noted in the legislation. But I think it also failed because of a very naive High Court judge who seemingly knew nothing about kleptocracy. I mentioned this guy earlier, Rahat Aliyev. Notorious in Kazakhstan for expropriating people's businesses when he was a member of the Kazakh tax police. He was accused of financial crime and money laundering. And at the time of his death, he was being held in an Austrian jail on suspicion of the murder of two bankers in Kazakhstan that he was alleged to have tortured and stuffed their bodies in barrels of lime. So not a very nice person to say the least. And yet when it came to the judgment, the judge said, just to explain this quote I'm going to show you, it's possible that even though the National Crime Agency has lost this unexplained wealth order case, it could still go to the civil recovery procedure because, as I said, this is a separate thing, and could try and argue that the assets that Dadiga Nazarbayeva sold to purchase these properties were tainted by former association to her ex-husband, who she divorced in 2007, Rahat Aliyev. And yet the judge said, notwithstanding his criminality, Rahat Aliyev had been a successful businessman in Kazakhstan, and JCA Kant is and was a legitimate business. It is a major sugar company. So let that kind of statement sink in for a second. There's this man who was known for various acts of criminality as being described as a successful businessman. Surely the criminality negates that success. The judge in this case showed very little understanding of the political economy of kleptocracies, where this kind of success is based on your relationship to the ruling family. And it was very galling as an anti-corruption campaigner to see a British High Court judge say such a thing in a judgment of one of the very first unexplained wealth orders. So that's it from me. As I say, in my last, I think I'm right about 20 minutes now. I'll use the last minute to say, unexplained wealth orders, great idea in essence, because they reverse the burden of proof. You basically can say, we don't have any information about this, therefore we're going to presume it's a criminally acquired asset. That's great. But that falls down when you're dealing with people who are still in power, because they're going to say, you know, these assets, this money is all legitimate, and I've got a law court to say it's legitimate. They could be effective against organized crime, but this wasn't the messaging we were told when unexplained wealth orders were brought in. So the legislation should be revisited. Can it be improved? Possibly, but I think there are perhaps more opportunities to clamp down on kleptocracy through the new UK anti-corruption sanctions regime, which maybe we can get onto a little bit in the question and answers. So thanks for your attention. That's all from me, and look forward to your questions.
Well, Tom, thanks for this insightful detail on unexplained wealth orders, and delving into some of the nuance as to why they have been largely ineffectual, and also wrapping up within 20 minutes. So great, great timing. And with that, we can kick off the discussion. So I suppose I can moderate the questions and any comments. So if anyone would like to come through onto the mic and go ahead and ask their question or add a comment. Alternatively, also you can fire away your questions in the chat, and I will be more than happy to relay those questions to the panel members. Okay, so we actually have a first question coming up here from Catherine Wilkins. Just to note, it's 20 to 4, so we have quite a bit of time. I'm not sure whether there's some flexibility if we can we would have additional 5 or 10 minutes if the discussion is lively and continues, but as I said, just add your comments and questions in the chat. So from Catherine, question to Samuel and Václav, who presented at the start, and you can probably see the question in the chat, but I'll just read it out for you. So what efforts are you aware of that attempt to quantify or track the shift in assets to emerging IFFs, hubs like United Arab Emirates or Singapore? And could you describe what data those efforts are based on?
Yeah.
Okay, Tony, sorry there. Okay, Tony, thank you. And so if anyone has a question for Tony, just fire away in the chat. Go ahead, Václav.
Yeah, I think I can take up the question. Catherine asks something really important. I mean, the availability of data is, of course, lacking when it comes to illicit financial flows. It is really difficult. Our kind of conclusions are more based on anecdotal, almost qualitative evidence. There is some quantitative data of, presented in a scattered way. So, for example, there was a study presented by Matthew Page, who is very well known to the UK audience. I think back in 2018, he traced the 800 properties in Dubai linked to politically exposed peasants. There was even a very well-documented effort where he linked concrete properties to specific political peasants, including their hierarchy in the system. Extremely interesting study. But I think more aggregated data is missing, and in particular data, for example, where looking at African to African kind of illicit financial flows. We have got emerging financial hubs in Mauritius, Seychelles, even in South Africa, where we have absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But when you go around a place like Abuja, for example, you would meet politically exposed people or their associates who would go to places and scope, how safe the assets would be in these new destinations. I remember back in 2018, actually, there was kind of panic in Abuja when the unexplained wealth order came up. There were even lawyers flown in for extremely interested audience, explaining how threatening the UWO might be. Since then, the interests have come down and tempers have been calmed a bit, but I mean, back, to respond to the question, you are right, Katrin. I mean, we are missing more aggregated data, and what we are presenting here is more based on kind of, life experience with being on the ground. Dave?
Thank you very much, Václav. And if there's anyone else that would like to come up and just maybe raise your hand, or just write in the chat that that you are. Oh, I see some hands up, so I'll follow up there. I think in my window it's showing that Chris was first, I think. So go ahead, Chris. Go.
Well, yeah, I hope it's okay for a panelist to ask another panelist a question. I think that's any breach of any rules. I actually had a question for Tom, because I mean, I was struck during his presentation. I mean, I think they're linked, because, it's the same challenge when it comes to, for example, due diligence. These kind of kleptocrats have no problems manufacturing the edifice to get through most due diligence procedures, and in fact they have law firms whose expertise is to help them manufacture that. And I think that was nicely exposed by Al Jazeera with their work in Cyprus, and I guess and that's why I sometimes am slightly skeptical when you hear like the BVI say we have the best due diligence and therefore that's a guard against corruption. It's not. It's just actually maybe a bigger goal would be transparency, but that's a side issue. I guess for Tom, it's if you have these conglomerates run by kleptocrats who can manufacture all sorts of commercial legal evidence, and they have on retainer the best legal minds, the best commercial minds that money can buy to help them build this edifice. Is there any hope that a very sort of modestly sort of resourced criminal justice agency will ever be able to beat them in a court?
I mean, it's a great question, and maybe the answer is no. But I think what was disappointing in the NCA versus Baker is that they didn't seem to draw on any expert testimony to counteract this edifice of information that had been, wrapped up in a little tiny bow by Mishcon Dereya. They needed somebody else to say, I'm, an expert in Kazakhstan's political economy, and I would not trust, the Kazakh prosecutor's office when they say this, and this. I think when it comes to the High Court and the UK authorities have said this, whatever legislation we create, it's probably going to happen that the professional enablers are going to find a way to circumvent it. And that's why I think, sanctions, which is basically just saying there's evidence here to suggest that person A or person B has been involved in corruption and is tied to a particularly nasty regime, we're going to sanction them. We're going to put them on the sanctions list. And then once that happens, you can then start to freeze their assets, because that's part of the sanctions regime. So it seems like a way of circumventing all this, back and forth in the High Court. And of course, with the problems we've seen recently in Kazakhstan, we've got a perfect opportunity to do that. Whether the UK authorities will sanction people from Kazakhstan in the same way they sanction people from Belarus remains to be seen.
If I could just briefly add to that, it strikes me that what Tom referred to as naivety is kind of built into the system, because the High Court has got to base its decisions on evidence, and however glaring obvious it may seem that the president's daughter is probably just as bent as the president's son-in-law, she can't say that without the evidence to base it on.
Absolutely, and I have heard people defend Justice Lang, you know, saying, well, what was she supposed to do? You know, she can't unilaterally say that this is corruption. It is interesting before that, you know, what Chris was saying, you know, Switzerland doesn't recognize, you know, legal rulings from Uzbekistan. In the UK, we seem to be all over the shop. So we're not sending Hajieva back to Baku because we're worried about whether she'll get a fair trial there, quite, you know, legitimately. But we're going to use some of the evidence from Hajiev's trial in Baku to suggest that her husband is perhaps guilty of financial crime. We do and we don't respect the sovereignty of other countries' legal systems, and it seems to be, you know, pick and choose depending on who's doing the decision making, and so I think that's something that needs to be looked at.
All right, well, thanks very much there for the coming in there, and I have Samuel up next here, so go ahead, you can I'll leave the floor.
Thank you very much, David. My question is for Tony, and I think maybe Tom can also just jump in and maybe give one or two insights. Tony, during your presentation, you talk about the unexplained wealth order, and you I think you mentioned the case while individuals need to be careful before, of course, getting these orders there, because it needs to actually be up to date and appropriate. My question is, looking at the revelations from the Pandora, Panama, and of course Paradise Papers, especially the Pandora, where we have lots of politically exposed persons from, I could say, Nigeria, for example, having assets in the United Kingdom. What would your response be to individuals or activists or civil society representatives from Nigeria who feel maybe the unexplained wealth order is not really being used enough, or the UK is not really doing enough in this regards? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I completely agree that it isn't being used enough. I mean, there's, you know, four cases ever, two of which were against PEPs, is not impressive, and I think they could be used more. That was the point. We have these tools and then we don't use them.
And I think coming in here, what's also striking is how, and this has been touched on in talks today, is that we only seem to do anything when, you know, somebody gets kicked out or deposed. So these assets that were you know, supposedly clean before, we don't do anything until there's a change of political leader. And you know, in relation to Nigeria, you know, we're going after Alison Madueke's houses. Well, you know, how come that money reached UK shores in the first place? Now, I think probably the NCA would say, well, you know, it's very hard to get evidence again, and this has been a theme of today. It's very hard to get evidence when you have somebody in power, and mounting a legal case may be very, very tricky. But it just seems, I think, I'm not sure what the word is, you know, dispiriting that, you know, we have to wait till these countries explode before we do anything. And as Chris, you know, strongly demonstrated in his presentation, it's these enablers who allow it to happen, who don't face any consequences, who are a major part of the problem. And if we somehow manage to clamp down on their activities and start putting some of these guys in jail and finding them, then perhaps less of this money would be reaching UK shores.
Thanks very much. And I don't see any more hands up or comments in the chat. But if I can come in with a brief question for Chris, unless someone else still has something to add there. No, okay, well, I think you mentioned at the end of your presentation, you mentioned quite an important point, which I think something, a motif that has recurred in other presentations, and that is that you know, there seems to be a certain lack of faith among civil society in the mechanisms and responses that are emerging in response to corruption and anti-money laundering and asset recovery. And just like in terms, or taking your case study as an example, what can be learned about, you know, the kind of things that civil society can expect and also do more actively in terms of you know, advocating and for more stringent and effective means of recovering stolen assets.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you know, I think the from my experience, and again, it's not systematic. It's based off work in a particular region that's connected to a number of financial centres. I think civil society can expect very little from in terms of state responses, because essentially you have, and I think it's important to keep in mind, everything that we're talking about is an invention, certainly, you know, a large part of the last 60 to 70 years of the development of international financial architecture to facilitate the free flow of capital between regions of the world, which created a set of fairly carefree funnels for money to move around effortlessly, which creates the perfect camouflage for large flows of illicit wealth to move. And then that's going into financial centers of the world whose job has been to manage wealth, and that's what they're interested in doing, and particularly large bodies of wealth. And they're you can put in all these AML laws, and it's not going to really you know, change that. I mean, you just have to look at, if you go onto the SFO's website and you look at their recent AML conviction against Barclays, you know, where the sort of things they were doing for client, once a client says, I have a large amount of money, and they go, the response seemed to be, well, how many elements of our AML obligations would you like us to ignore to facilitate your business, sir? I mean, you know, that was sort of the sort of message that came from that, where they were. So I think, and that then means that there is a really productive role for civil society to play in exposing what's going on. And that's where I think, you know, some of the battlegrounds around transparency are so important, because the more information that's available to civil society, the more opportunity they have to demonstrate that there are clearly incongruent transactions taking place on a systematic basis and nothing's being done. So I think civil society has that role to kind of be able to point to these contradictions. But it can't do that without a certain, at least minimal body of information being made available, which is why I think this move to the East is, you know, one that's going to create an additional challenge for civil society, because anyone who's tried to do basic, you know, oh, there's this very suspicious transaction involving holding company from the UAE or holding company from Turkey, or even holding company from Singapore, you get very little in back from those corporate registers, and therefore the investigation ends unless you have an inside source or some alternative way for getting information. And I think when it comes to the asset return process, the lesson's been that, you know, asset return is something that's controlled by state parties, and therefore you know, your civil society is invited in at the pleasure of the state parties, and if the civil society begin raising too much of a stink about how the money is being returned, whether it be from Switzerland to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Nigeria, or wherever, they won't be invited into the room. So again, I think civil society is facing, you know, quite a lot of challenges in regards to that. But I think from the papers yesterday, there was a really strong theme that civil society, the more it can diffuse norms around A, that it's critical to include civil society in asset return processes, and B, it's a fundamental international human rights obligation to live up to some of those, then there's more mechanisms for civil society to push back. So yeah, but just one other thing I want to make with that I think is interesting, and it links back to some of the others. With the Karamova case, I should have said, you know, what's also fascinating there is you've seen prosecutions in America, you've seen prosecutions in the Netherlands, you've seen prosecutions in Switzerland, you've seen prosecutions in Sweden, you've seen prosecutions in Uzbekistan, but where was the one place where a significant amount of the activity took place? In the global leading anti-corruption country, UK. How many prosecutions have taken place in the UK? 0. Despite the fact that all the companies were registered in the UK, and despite the fact that the significant amount of money went through the UK, and despite the fact that the significant amount of the UK law firms were in the UK. There's not been one single response, and I think that's very telling about the UK's commitment. It speaks a lot in policy, but often doesn't deliver practically.
Yeah, and I agree, as explored in other contributions today as well. The UK seems to be the main suspect there when it comes to enabling and assisting the kleptocrats from other countries in laundering their funds. So it will probably, there will be still quite a bit of material for years to come coming from UK, and plenty of case studies for academics to flesh out and explore and investigate more, and hopefully present and share at more of these events like this one. But we're at 4 o'clock on the button, so with that, I think I'm not sure whether we have time if anyone else would like to pose a question or throw something in there. And from Sue, just Mishcon has just been fined for AML failings, so there you go. But I think I'm not sure who is the administrator for the Zoom conference, Jackson or someone else. So yeah, I think that's gonna wrap up today's session.
Yeah, well, if I can just conclude, because given I'm also one of the conference co-organizers, just to say thank you very much to everyone who's participated throughout the last 2 days. Very interesting set of papers, and I think it's a testament to the fact that as bleak as some of the situation appears to be, there's certainly a lot of really innovative, important research being done, both within civil society, within the professional community, and within the academic community. So I just thank all the presenters and today and yesterday, and also all the friends and colleagues who participated and asked really great questions, and also to Sifar and Jackson and Brianna for all the work they've done in setting this up. It's been great. So and thank you to you, David, as well for chairing today. So thanks everyone.
All right, thanks everyone, and have a lovely afternoon, evening, and weekend ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks
to Chris as well.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.